David Chen had been staring at the same math problem for 20 minutes, but his mind kept wandering to the empty refrigerator back at his tiny apartment. The university library was warm and quiet, a welcome escape from his cold studio where the heating barely worked. He checked his phone to 4:30 p.m. His shift at the Grandview Country Club started at 6, which meant he had just enough time to grab a quick snack from the dollar store and change into his server uniform. 3 months ago, David thought his biggest worry would be choosing between different music schools for his graduate program. He had it all planned out: finish his bachelor's degree in piano performance, apply for the prestigious Thornton Scholarship, and spend the next 2 years perfecting his craft under world-class instructors. But life had other plans. The scholarship committee sent their rejection letter on the same day his mom called to tell him his dad had been laid off from the factory. "We're so sorry, honey," his mom had said, her voice shaking through the phone. "We know how much this means to you, but we just can't help with tuition anymore." David remembered staring at that letter, feeling like his whole future was crumbling. $20,000 for his final semester, it might as well have been $1 million. That's when he found the job posting for servers at Grandview Country Club. The pay was decent, and they were looking for someone who could work nights and weekends. David figured he could balance it with his morning classes and practice sessions. What he didn't expect was how exhausting it would be, or how different this world would feel from anything he'd ever known. The country club sat on a hill, overlooking the city with perfectly manicured lawns and a circular driveway lined with expensive cars. The first time David walked through those heavy oak doors, he felt like he was entering a different universe. Everything was polished and pristine: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of old men in suits hanging on dark wood walls. The dining room alone was bigger than his family's entire house. His supervisor, Mr. Harrison, was a thin man with graying hair who spoke in hushed tones and seemed to glide rather than walk. "Remember," he told David during training, "our members expect perfection. They don't want to notice you're here, they want their needs met before they even realize they have them. Speak only when spoken to, move quietly, and always smile." David learned quickly that the members lived in a world he could barely imagine. They casually discussed buying second homes in places he'd only seen in movies. They complained about their yacht captains and argued about which private jets had the best champagne service. He served tables where a single bottle of wine cost more than his monthly rent, and where the tip left behind could pay for a week's worth of groceries. But David was a good student, and he applied the same focus to serving that he did to practicing. Piano, he memorized every member's name and their usual orders. He learned to anticipate when someone needed a water refill or when they were ready for their check. He practiced carrying multiple plates without making a sound, balancing heavy trays while navigating between tables with chairs that cost more than most people's cars. The other servers were mostly college students like him, working to pay for school or support their families. There was Lisa, a pre-med student who sent half her paycheck to her grandmother in another state. Kevin was saving money to help his sister with her wedding, and Amanda was working 3 jobs to support her baby daughter. They became like family, sharing stories during their 15-minute breaks and covering for each other when life got complicated. David's favorite part of the job wasn't the money or even the flexible schedule, it was the piano. Sitting in the corner of the main dining room was a beautiful black Steinway grand piano, its surface so polished you could see your reflection in it. Most evenings, a professional pianist would play soft classical music while the members enjoyed their meals. David would find excuses to walk past it, running his fingers along its smooth surface when no one was looking. "That's a beautiful instrument," he mentioned to Mr. Harrison one evening while wiping down tables after closing. "Indeed it is," Mr. Harrison replied, carefully arranging the cloth napkins. "It was donated by the Ashworth family 15 years ago. Mrs. Catherine Ashworth is one of our most generous members. She has quite an appreciation for the arts." David had served Mrs. Ashworth many times. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair always styled perfectly and jewelry that caught the light from across the room. She was known for being particular about her service, her water glass couldn't be more than half empty. Her salad had to be served on a chilled plate, and she expected her server to know exactly how she liked her coffee without asking. But she was also fair, and she tipped well when everything met her standards. The regular pianist was a man named Robert who had been playing at the club for over a decade. He had a gentle way with the keys and seemed to know exactly what music fit each moment of the evening. David would sometimes linger nearby when Robert played, closing his eyes and letting the familiar melodies wash over him. It reminded him of why he fell in love with music in the first place, but David's real practice time came after his shifts ended. He would drive to the university, use his student ID to get into the music building, and spend hours in the practice rooms. His favorite was a small room on the third floor with an old upright piano that had seen better days. The keys were slightly yellow with age, and some of the hammers stuck occasionally, but it was his refuge. He would play until his fingers ached, working through the pieces he'd been studying before his world turned upside down. Sometimes other students would peek in, drawn by the sound of Chopin or Rachmaninoff echoing through the hallways at midnight. David had always been talented, but the pressure of his situation had pushed him to a new level. Every note mattered now. Every practice session was precious because he didn't know how many more he would have his classmates talked about their summer plans, music festivals in Europe, master classes with famous teachers, internships with symphony orchestras. David just smiled and nodded, not mentioning that he was serving their family's dinner on weekends, carrying their plates and refilling their wine glasses. While they discussed their children's promising musical careers, the hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion or even the constant worry about money. It was the feeling of being invisible in a world where music was treated as decoration. At the country club, the piano was background noise, something pleasant to accompany conversation about stock portfolios and vacation homes. The members barely noticed when Robert played, taking for granted something David would give anything to do professionally, but David held on to his dreams. Every night after work, he would sit in that practice room and remind himself why he was doing this. The money from the country club was slowly adding up. If he could just make it through this semester, if he could just keep going a little longer, maybe he could find another way to finish his degree. Maybe he could audition for scholarships at other schools or find a teacher who would work with him privately. Tonight was different, though. Tonight was the club's annual charity gala, their biggest event of the year. The dining room had been decorated with white flowers and gold accents, and the guest list included the most influential people in the city. David had been chosen to work the event, which meant better tips but also higher pressure. Mr. Harrison had reminded the entire staff that everything had to be perfect. As David finished his studying and packed his backpack, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be important somehow. Maybe it was just the excitement of the big event, or maybe it was something else entirely. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door, not knowing that in just a few hours his life would change forever. The charity gala was in full swing by 7:30, and David had never seen the country club look so elegant. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandeliers, and the soft buzz of conversation filled the air. He adjusted his black bow tie for the 10th time that evening, making sure his white shirt was perfectly pressed. Tonight, there was no room for mistakes. David had been assigned to Section 3, which included some of the club's most important members. Mrs. Catherine Ashworth sat at table 12 with her usual group of friends, all wearing jewelry that probably cost more than David's car. At table 14, the mayor was discussing city planning with several prominent businessmen. Table 15 hosted the Weatherby family, who owned half the commercial real estate downtown. The evening had started smoothly. David moved between his tables with practiced ease, making sure water glasses stayed full and wine was poured at just the right moment. He had memorized every guest's preferences from the pre-event briefing. Mrs. Ashworth liked her champagne served in a chilled glass with a single strawberry. The mayor preferred his bread rolls warmed and his butter soft. Mrs. Weatherby always asked for extra lemon with her water. "David," whispered Kevin, appearing at his elbow during a brief lull. "Chef Rodriguez needs help carrying out the main course. Robert called in sick, so they're running behind in the kitchen. David nodded and made his way to the kitchen, where the controlled chaos of a major event was in full swing. Servers rushed back and forth, carrying trays of perfectly plated food. The head chef, a stocky man with graying temples, was barking orders while putting finishing touches on the evening specialty. "Beef Wellington for Section 3, called out one of the line cooks, sliding a heavy silver tray across the stainless steel counter. 6 plates, all medium rare. David hefted the tray, feeling the weight of the expensive entrees. Each plate was a work of art, perfectly wrapped beef surrounded by colorful vegetables and drizzled with a rich sauce. He had carried heavier trays before, but tonight felt different. The stakes were higher, the pressure more intense. As he pushed through the swinging doors back into the dining room, David noticed the subtle changes that marked the evening's progression. The conversations had grown more animated as the wine flowed, laughter rang out from various tables, and the general mood was festive and warm. The charity auction had raised over $50,000, and everyone seemed pleased with the evening's success. David approached table 12 first, Mrs. Ashworth's table. She was in the middle of telling a story about her recent trip to France, her hands gesturing elegantly as she spoke. The other ladies at the table were listening intently, occasionally murmuring their appreciation for her adventure. "The little café in Provence was absolutely charming," Mrs. Ashworth was saying. "The owner's wife made the most incredible lavender honey that I've ever tasted. I brought back 12 jars for my friends." David waited patiently for a break in the conversation, holding the heavy tray steady. He had learned early in his time at the club that interrupting a member's story was one of the worst mistakes a server could make. Mrs. Ashworth continued her tale, describing the rolling hills and ancient stone buildings of the French countryside. Finally, she paused to take a sip of her champagne. David stepped forward carefully, beginning to lower the tray toward the serving station next to the table. This was always the most delicate part, transitioning from carrying the tray to placing it down safely. "Oh, Margaret," Mrs. Ashworth suddenly exclaimed, her voice rising with excitement. "I can't believe you're here. I thought you were still in Europe." David heard the commotion but couldn't see what was happening. He was focused on the tray, on the precise movements needed to set it down without disturbing the perfectly arranged plates. But then he felt it, a sharp bump against his leg as Mrs. Ashworth's chair scraped backward. Time seemed to slow down. David felt his balance shift, his grip on the tray loosening despite his desperate attempt to hold on. The heavy silver tray tilted, and he watched in horror as the 6 plates of beef Wellington began to slide. "No, no, no," David whispered under his breath, trying to adjust his grip, trying to save the situation, but physics had already taken over. The tray was too heavy, the angle too steep, the crash was thunderous. 6 plates of carefully prepared food hit the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire dining room. The rich brown sauce splattered across the Persian rug, and pieces of beef and vegetables scattered in every direction. But that wasn't the worst part. Mrs. Ashworth had stood up quickly to embrace her friend Margaret, and she was directly in the path of the falling food. The expensive beef Wellington and its sauce painted the front of her elegant silver dress, leaving dark stains across the delicate fabric. Drops of sauce had even reached her perfectly styled hair. The dining room fell silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the disaster unfolding at table 12. David stood frozen, the empty tray still in his hands, looking at the mess he had created. Mrs. Ashworth looked down at her ruined dress, her face cycling through shock, disbelief, and finally, fury. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft classical music that continued to play from the sound system since Robert wasn't there to read the room and stop. "This is absolutely unacceptable." Mrs. Ashworth's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Her face had turned red, and her hands were shaking with anger. "Look at my dress! This is a designer gown that cost more than most people make in a month." David opened his mouth to apologize, but no words came out. He felt like his throat had closed up completely. Around him, he could hear the whispers starting up from other tables, the shocked murmurs of the other guests. I demand to speak to the manager immediately, Mrs. Ashworth continued, her voice getting louder. This kind of carelessness is inexcusable. Someone this clumsy has no business working in an establishment like this. Mr. Harrison appeared as if from nowhere, his face pale and his usual composed demeanor cracking under the pressure. David had never seen his supervisor look so panicked. Mr. Harrison's eyes took in the scene, the ruined dress, the food scattered across the expensive carpet, the crowd of influential guests all staring at the disaster. Mrs. Ashworth, I am so terribly sorry, Mr. Harrison began, his voice trembling slightly. Please let me arrange for your dress to be professionally cleaned. We'll cover all the costs, of course, and cleaning? Mrs. Ashworth interrupted, her voice rising even higher. You think cleaning will fix this? This dress is ruined. And this evening is ruined. I have never been so humiliated in my entire life. David finally found his voice. Mrs. Ashworth, I'm so sorry. It was an accident. I never meant an accident, she snapped, turning her furious gaze on him. This is negligence. Pure and simple. Negligence. You weren't paying attention, and now look what's happened. The crowd had formed a circle around the scene, and David could feel every eye on him. He recognized faces from the society pages of the newspaper, people who could destroy reputations with a single phone call. His hands were shaking now, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the air. Conditioning. Mr. Harrison was frantically trying to clean the sauce from Mrs. Ashworth's dress with a napkin, but he was only making it worse. The stain was spreading, and the fabric was clearly damaged beyond repair. I want him fired, Mrs. Ashworth declared, pointing directly at David. Tonight, right now. I don't want to see him in this establishment ever again. The words hit David like a physical blow. Fired, his job, his income, his way of paying for school, all of it disappearing in an instant. He thought about his parents, about the bills piling up at home, about his dreams of finishing his music degree. Everything was crumbling. Mr. Harrison was nodding, clearly calculating the cost of losing Mrs. Ashworth's membership and donations against keeping one server. It wasn't even a close contest. Security, Mr. Harrison called out, his voice heavy with resignation. Please escort David out of the building. As two security guards approached, David felt something strange happening inside him. Instead of panic or desperation, he felt an odd calm settling over him. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the realization that he had nothing left to lose. But as he stood there, surrounded by hostile faces and watching his future disappear, David's eyes wandered to the silent piano in the corner. For 3 months, he had walked past that instrument every night, dreaming of what it would feel like to play it. Now, with his job ending and his dreams seemingly shattered, a crazy idea began to form in his mind. The security guards were only a few steps away when David felt something shift inside him. It wasn't anger or desperation, it was something much stranger. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt completely calm. The noise of the shocked crowd seemed to fade into the background, and all he could see was that beautiful black piano sitting silently in the corner. Wait, David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But somehow, in the tense silence of the room, everyone heard him. Mrs. Ashworth turned toward him, her eyes still blazing with fury. Excuse me? Did you just tell me to wait? After what you've done? David took a deep breath and looked directly at her. 3 months of serving her table had taught him exactly what kind of person she was. Beneath all that anger and entitlement, Mrs. Ashworth was someone who appreciated excellence. She demanded perfection in everything, her food, her service, her surroundings. She was harsh, but she was also fair when someone met her impossibly high standards. Mrs. Ashworth, David said, his voice getting stronger, I know I've ruined your evening. I know I've embarrassed you in front of your friends. And I know there's nothing I can do to fix your dress or take back what happened. Mr. Harrison was making frantic hand gestures, trying to signal David to stop talking. The security guards had paused, unsure whether to continue forward or wait. The entire room was watching this young server address one of the most powerful women in the city. But, David continued, Before I leave, would you let me do something for you? As an apology? Mrs. Ashworth's eyebrows shot up. An apology? What could you possibly do that would make up for this disaster? David's eyes moved to the piano and then back to her face. Would you let me play something for you? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. For a moment, nobody seemed to breathe. Then a ripple of confused murmurs spread through the crowd. Someone in the back laughed nervously. Another person whispered, "Is he serious?" Mrs. Ashworth's expression shifted from fury to complete bewilderment. Play? Play what? Are you making fun of me? The piano, David said simply, nodding toward the instrument. I'd like to play something for you, for everyone. As my way of saying sorry, Mr. Harrison's face had gone completely white. David, what are you doing? He hissed under his breath. Stop this right now and just go quietly. But David wasn't listening to his supervisor anymore. He was watching Mrs. Ashworth's face, trying to read her reaction. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with curiosity. She was studying him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. You want to play the piano? She repeated slowly. Our piano? Yes, ma'am, if you'll let me. The crowd was getting restless. David could hear snippets of conversation from the surrounding tables. What is this kid doing? Is he having some kind of breakdown? Someone should just call security and end this circus. Mrs. Ashworth looked around the room, taking in the faces of her friends and fellow club members. Everyone was staring at her, waiting to see how she would handle this bizarre situation. David realized that, in some strange way, he had put her in a position where she had to make a choice that would define her in front of everyone she cared about impressing. Are you telling me, she said slowly, that you think you can just waltz over to our very expensive piano and play some little tune, and that somehow that will make up for ruining my dress and humiliating me in front of my friends? No, ma'am, David replied honestly. I don't think it will make up for what happened. Nothing can do that. But I'd like to try to give you something beautiful instead of just leaving you with this mess. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, who had been sitting quietly at table 15, suddenly spoke up. Catherine, let the boy play. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had been a patron of the arts for decades. What harm could it do? We're all here anyway. Mrs. Ashworth turned to look at her friend. Dr. Chun was known for her refined taste and her support of young musicians. If she thought this was worth doing, maybe there was something to it. You're serious about this? Mrs. Ashworth asked David. You actually know how to play? Yes, ma'am. I've been studying piano for 15 years. That piece of information seemed to surprise her. She looked at him more carefully, as if seeing him for the first time. 15 years? You're a music student? Yes, ma'am. At the university. I'm finishing my degree in piano performance. Now the murmurs in the crowd changed tone. People were whispering to each other, trying to process this new information. The clumsy server was actually a trained musician? It didn't fit with their assumptions about who worked in service jobs. Mrs. Ashworth glanced around the room one more time. David could see her calculating, weighing her anger against her curiosity, her desire for revenge against her love of music. She was a complex woman, and this was a complex situation. Fine, she said finally. You have 5 minutes. But if you embarrass yourself and waste everyone's time, I'll make sure you never work in this city again. David nodded, feeling his heart start to race. Thank you. He walked toward the piano, and the crowd parted to let him through. Each step felt surreal, like he was walking through a dream. 3 months of serving these people, of being invisible, of being just another piece of the background, and now they were all watching him, waiting to see what he would do. The piano bench was exactly the right height. David had noticed that detail during his many nights of walking past it. He sat down and lifted the lid, revealing the beautiful ivory keys. The Steinway was perfectly tuned, its touch responsive and smooth under his fingers. For a moment he just sat there, letting his hands rest on the keys without pressing them down. The room was completely silent now. Even the kitchen sounds had stopped. The staff had all gathered in the doorway to watch what was happening. David closed his eyes and thought about everything that had led to this moment. His parents' phone call about his dad losing his job, the rejection letter from the scholarship committee, the long nights of studying and working, trying to balance his dreams with reality, the hours spent in practice rooms, playing on old pianos that were out of tune and falling apart. But he also thought about why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about the prestige or the career prospects. It was about the feeling of taking something beautiful that existed only in your mind and making it real, sharing it with other people. It was about the moment when technique disappeared and all that remained was pure emotion flowing through your fingers. David opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd. Mrs. Ashworth was standing directly in front of the piano, her arms crossed. Her stained dress, a reminder of the disaster that had brought them all to this moment. Behind her, dozens of faces stared back at him, some curious, some skeptical, some already writing him off as a desperate young man about to make a fool of himself. He thought about all the times he had dreamed of performing for an audience like this. Important people, influential people, people who could change his life with a single phone call. He had always imagined it would happen in a concert hall, after years of preparation and perfect conditions. He never thought it would happen in a dining room, wearing a stained server's uniform, with his future hanging in the balance, but maybe that was exactly what made this moment so powerful. There was nothing left to lose, nothing left to protect. Just him, the piano, and the music. That had been waiting inside him for exactly this moment. David placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes that came from the piano were soft and gentle, like a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. David had chosen Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had always felt like coming home to him. His fingers moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who had played this melody 1,000 times, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, every note mattered. The crowd was still murmuring, still skeptical. David could feel their doubt in the air around him. These people had heard professional pianists before. They knew what real talent sounded like. He was just a server, a college student working to pay his bills. What could he possibly offer them that they hadn't already heard? But as the melody developed, something began to change. The whispered conversations started to fade. People who had been looking at their phones or checking their watches began to turn their attention to the piano. The music was drawing them in, note by note, phrase by phrase. David's technique was flawless, but that wasn't what made people stop and listen. It was the emotion behind the notes. Every struggle he had faced over the past few months was flowing through his fingers. The worry about money, the exhaustion from working double shifts, the fear that his dreams were slipping away, all of it was being transformed into something beautiful. Mrs. Ashworth was standing directly in front of the piano, her arms still crossed, but David noticed that her posture had changed. The rigid anger was softening into something else. Her eyes were fixed on his hands. Watching the way his fingers danced across the keys with impossible grace, the nocturne reached its most challenging section, where the melody soared above a complex pattern of accompanying notes. David's left hand maintained the steady rhythm while his right hand sang out the beautiful tune. This was the part that separated good pianists from great ones, the ability to make it sound effortless when it was actually incredibly difficult. Someone in the back of the room whispered, "My God, he's actually good." David transitioned seamlessly into the second section of the piece, where Chopin's genius really showed. The melody became more complex, more emotional, building to moments of incredible beauty before settling back into gentle reflection. David had always loved this part because it felt like a conversation between hope and sadness, between dreams and reality. As he played, David began to forget about the crowd, about Mrs. Ashworth's ruined dress, about the disaster that had brought him to this moment. He was transported to all those late nights in the practice rooms, all those hours spent perfecting his technique, all those dreams of sharing music with people who would truly appreciate it. The transformation was visible to everyone watching. The nervous, apologetic server was disappearing. replaced by a confident artist who commanded the instrument with authority and passion. His posture straightened, his movements became more fluid, and his face took on an expression of pure concentration. "Enjoy." Dr. Chun leaned over to the person next to her and whispered, "This boy has real talent." "This is extraordinary." The nocturne was building to its climax now, and David's playing became more intense, more emotional. His fingers flew across the keys with precision and power, creating sounds that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. The melody soared and dipped, painting pictures in the air that everyone in the room could see. Mrs. Ashworth's friend Margaret, who had been the cause of the original accident, had tears forming in her eyes. "Catherine," she whispered, "I've never heard anything like this." But David wasn't finished. As the nocturne came to its gentle conclusion, he didn't pause. Instead, he moved directly into Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one of the most challenging and emotionally powerful pieces in the piano repertoire. The change was dramatic, from Chopin's gentle beauty to Rachmaninoff's raw, passionate intensity. The opening chords thundered through the room, and several people actually jumped in their seats. This wasn't background music anymore. This was a full concert performance. David's entire body was involved now, his shoulders and arms moving with the rhythm, his face showing the intense concentration required to master such a difficult piece. The Prelude was like a storm made of music. Dark, powerful chords crashed like waves, while delicate melodies floated above them like birds riding the wind. David's technique was stunning. His fingers moved so fast they seemed to blur, yet every note was crystal clear and perfectly placed. Mayor Johnson, who had been checking his phone throughout the evening, put it away completely and moved closer to the piano. He had heard this piece performed by the city's symphony orchestra, but somehow this young man was making it sound even more powerful, more immediate. The crowd was growing larger as word spread through the club. Staff members who had been working in other parts of the building were quietly slipping into the dining room to listen. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their cleaning to gather in the doorway, their faces showing amazement at what they were hearing. David reached the most famous section of the Prelude, where the melody becomes almost unbearably beautiful. His right hand sang out the tune while his left hand provided an accompaniment that was both supportive and challenging. The music seemed to fill every corner of the room, reaching into places that people had forgotten existed. Mrs. Ashworth was no longer thinking about her ruined dress. She was completely absorbed in the music, her face showing the kind of wonder that only comes from witnessing something truly special. She had attended hundreds of concerts in her life, had heard world-famous pianists perform in the greatest concert halls, but there was something about this moment that felt different. Maybe it was the setting, the intimacy of the club's dining room instead of a formal concert hall. Maybe it was the circumstances, the fact that this incredible talent had been hidden behind a server's uniform. Or maybe it was simply that David was playing with the kind of raw emotion that only comes from having nothing left to lose. The Prelude was approaching its dramatic conclusion, and David's playing became even more intense. His whole body was moving with the music now, his face showing the strain of channeling such powerful emotions through his fingers. Sweat was beading on his forehead, but his technique never wavered. The final section of the piece was like a musical earthquake. Massive chords rolled through the room, each one perfectly controlled despite their incredible power. David's left hand was playing passages that would challenge even professional pianists, while his right hand maintained the soaring melody that tied everything together. As the piece reached its climax, the entire room was holding its breath. Even the chandeliers seemed to be trembling from the intensity of the music. David's fingers were flying across the keys with impossible speed and precision, creating sounds that seemed to come from another world. And then, suddenly, it was over. The final chord rang out through the room, echoing off the walls and slowly fading into silence. David's hands remained on the keys for a moment, his head bowed, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. The silence that followed was complete and profound. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. They were all processing what they had just witnessed. trying to understand how someone they had seen as just a server could create something so beautiful, so powerful, so completely transformative. David slowly lifted his head and looked out at the crowd. The faces staring back at him were completely different from the ones he had seen just minutes before. The skepticism was gone, replaced by awe, wonder, and something that looked very much like respect. Mrs. Ashworth was standing directly in front of him, her hands pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with amazement. For a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then slowly she began to smile. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. David sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, not sure what to do next. He had poured everything into those two pieces, all his frustration, all his dreams, all his hope. Now, he felt empty, but in a good way, like he had finally said everything he needed to say. Then Mrs. Ashworth began to clap. It started as a slow, deliberate applause, her hands coming together with measured precision. But as she continued, the tempo increased and the sound grew stronger. Her face was transformed, the anger and humiliation completely gone, replaced by something that looked like wonder. "Bravo," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Bravo." That single word seemed to break a spell. Suddenly, the entire room erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, reserved clapping that usually followed the club's musical entertainment. This was thunderous, enthusiastic applause that came from deep emotion. People were standing up, their faces showing genuine amazement and respect. David stood up slowly, his legs feeling a bit shaky. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and he was beginning to realize what had just happened. He had played for some of the most important people in the city, and they were giving him a standing ovation. Dr. Chun was the first to approach him. She walked directly to the piano, her eyes bright with excitement. "Young man," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "where did you learn to play like that?" David's mouth felt dry. "I've been studying at the university, ma'am. Piano performance major." "University?" Dr. Chun looked surprised. "But you work here as a server?" "Yes, ma'am. I needed the job to pay for my final semester. My scholarship fell through, and my family couldn't help with the tuition." Dr. Chun's expression changed to one of concern. "You're telling me that someone with your talent is working as a server because you can't afford to finish school?" Before David could answer, Mrs. Ashworth stepped forward. Up close, he could see that her eyes were still wet with tears. The stains on her dress seemed unimportant now, forgotten in the face of what she had just experienced. "David," she said, softly, using his name for the first time in 3 months of serving her table, "how much do you need to finish your degree?" The question caught him off guard. "I what?" "Your tuition." "How much do you need?" David's mind was spinning. Why was she asking? "About $20,000, ma'am." For the last semester and living expenses. Mrs. Ashworth didn't hesitate. "Consider it paid for." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. David stared at her, not sure he had heard correctly. "I'm sorry, what?" "I said consider it paid for. Your tuition, your living expenses, whatever you need to finish your degree. I'll write you a check tonight." David felt like the room was spinning. This couldn't be real. People didn't just offer to pay for a stranger's education, especially not after that stranger had ruined their expensive dress. "Mrs. Ashworth, I can't accept that. I ruined your dress, I embarrassed you in front of your friends." She held up her hand to stop him. "David, in 50 years of attending concerts and supporting the arts, I have never heard anything like what you just played. That dress?" She looked down at the stained fabric and laughed. "It's just a dress. What you just gave us was priceless." Dr. Chun was nodding enthusiastically. "Catherine is absolutely right. David, I'm on the board of the City Philharmonic. We have a young artist program that provides scholarships and performance opportunities for exceptional talents. I want you to audition for us next week." "But I'm not even finished with my degree yet," David protested. "That doesn't matter," Dr. Chun replied. "Talent like yours doesn't come along often. We can work around the academic requirements." Suddenly, other people were approaching the piano. The mayor stepped forward, pulling out his business card. David, the city sponsors several music education programs. I'd like to discuss how we might support your career. Mr. Weatherby, the real estate developer, was right behind him. Young man, I host fundraising events throughout the year. I'd be honored to have you perform at them. The pay would be quite substantial. David looked around in amazement. These were the same people who had been staring at him with disgust just minutes earlier. Now they were offering him opportunities he had only dreamed about. Mrs. Ashworth's friend Margaret stepped forward, her face still showing the emotion from the performance. David, I organize the annual arts festival. We always feature young performers, but we've never had anyone of your caliber. Would you consider being our featured artist next year? The offers kept coming. Business cards were being thrust into his hands. People were talking about concerts, recordings, scholarships, and opportunities that would have taken him years to find on his own. David felt overwhelmed, like he was drowning in possibilities. Mr. Harrison, who had been standing frozen in shock throughout the entire performance, finally found his voice. David, I don't know what to say. I had no idea you were so talented. David looked at his supervisor, remembering how different everything had been just 20 minutes ago. Mr. Harrison, I understand if you still need to fire me. I did. Ruin Mrs. Ashworth's dress, and I did cause a scene. Mrs. Ashworth laughed, a sound that was completely different from her usual reserved demeanor. Fire you after what you just did? Mr. Harrison, if you even think about firing this young man, you'll be looking for a new job yourself. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement. David could hear people talking about the performance, describing it to others who had missed it. Someone was already on their phone, probably calling friends to tell them about the amazing musician they had just discovered. Kevin, his fellow server, appeared at his elbow. Dude, he whispered, that was incredible. I had no idea you could play like that. David smiled at his friend. I've been practicing for 15 years. I just never had the chance to show anyone. Well, you've definitely shown them now, Kevin sighed, grinning. I don't think anyone's going to forget this night. Dr. Chun was still talking to other board members about the audition. Mrs. Ashworth was discussing details with her accountant about the scholarship payment. The mayor was making notes about city arts programs. David stood in the middle of it all, still wearing his stained server's uniform, still holding the empty tray from the disaster that had started everything. 6 months later, David walked onto the stage of the city's premier concert hall. The audience was packed, and he could see Mrs. Ashworth in the front row, wearing a beautiful new dress and beaming with pride. Dr. Chun was there too, along with many of the other people who had been in the country club dining room that night. The program listed him as David Chun, rising star of classical piano. The bio mentioned his upcoming graduation, his acceptance into the prestigious graduate program he had always dreamed of, and his debut recording contract with a major label. As David sat down at the concert grand piano, he thought about that night at the country club. The disaster that had seemed like the end of his dreams had actually been the beginning of everything he had ever wanted. Sometimes, he realized, the worst moments in life are just opportunities in disguise. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play, knowing that this time he was exactly where he belonged. The server who had stumbled and spilled dinner had become the classical music world's newest star. And it all started with a single moment of courage, when he decided to turn his biggest mistake into his greatest triumph.